Our first speaker is going to be Andy Atkins, the Executive Director of Friends of the Earth. Our second speaker is Doa, who is the General Secretary of Equity Bangladesh. And lastly, we will have Hilary Thorndike, who's Operations Manager from the Refugee Council. So first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I really want to start, and I'll end, by urging you to commit tonight to taking even more action than you're probably taking already around climate change. And I hope in the next 10 minutes to explain why that's so critical and why I think we can all make a difference in the next month, and my goodness, we need to. There are only 16 days away from the beginning of the most important negotiations I think the human race has ever seen. That's not hyperbole. If you look at the science, if you look at the politics, I think that's absolutely correct. I'll explain why that is so important from a justice perspective, also from a political perspective and a scientific perspective, and then try and give you some ideas on what actually you can do about this. Let me take the science first of all, and I'm sure just about everybody in this room will already believe that climate change is happening. I'm not trying to convince you of that, but just to be clear, the science is very, very simple. It was actually posited, the greenhouse effect was posited in the 1800s through simple physics, and it turned out to be horribly true. That if you put certain kinds of pollutants into the atmosphere, they trap the sun's heat when it comes in, so it can't get out again, and gradually we heat up, just like a greenhouse. And that's exactly what's happening. We now know for certain the theory was absolutely correct. That's what's happening. Okay? The science is really, really simple. So, what we now know is that if we heat up more than 2 degrees beyond pre-industrial levels, we will trigger runaway climate change. It might even be less than 2 degrees. Runaway climate change will happen because the big stores of carbon, like the forests, like the Arctic tundra, which currently lock up gigatons of carbon, will release it. They will start to release it, and that will trigger a spiral of events that we will never stop. The science also says that at something like 4 degrees, really you're talking of 2/3 of the world being uninhabitable. It won't necessarily be too hot to live there, but the change in temperature will so affect rainfall and so affect ecosystems that people will not be able to live there because there will be no water. You will not be able to grow crops. Okay, so the day the taps go off is the day you leave home. We'll hear more about that sort of thing, I'm sure, from Hilary from the British Refugee Council, the implications of this for mass migration, for example. So that's what the science is saying. We've got to keep temperature beneath a 2-degree rise above pre-industrial level. Now, we are already at 0.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels from the pollution we've already put into the atmosphere, and because of the delayed time effect of putting pollution in the atmosphere and it rising the temperature, there's a delay of about 30 years at least, we are already committed to at least another 0.5 of a degree of rise. We can't stop it. Even if we stopped all emissions today, the temperature would continue to go up for at least another 0.5 a degree, which actually means we've got very, very little room for manoeuvre between where we are now, what we're already committed to, and 0.2 degrees. That is why it is so urgent that the world takes action very, very fast to start bringing emissions down. Now, there are different emissions trajectories, they call it, different speeds at which you can come down and different probabilities of that triggering runaway climate change if you don't do it soon enough. But very broadly, if you want to have at least a 50-50 chance of avoiding runaway climate change, you have to peak global emissions by 2015, 2020 at the very latest. Okay, that's within the next 5 to 10 years, and you have to start cutting emissions very sharply thereafter in order to achieve at least an 85% cut in emissions by 2050. But the key figure there is not 2050, it's 2015. We've only got about 5 years to 10 maximum to peak our emissions globally and start bringing them down. Again, that is why it is so urgent we make progress at Copenhagen in getting international agreement on the kind of cuts that need to be made. So that's the science in very broad terms. I can answer more questions on that later. There are limits. I'm not a scientist, but I do talk to a lot of scientists. Okay? But it's no point just going for a scientifically sound deal, although we must at Copenhagen. It's also got to be sound according to justice. Now, I'm sure all of us in this room are very committed to justice, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here tonight. But I'm not just saying that because justice is a nice thing, we should aspire to it. It's because practically we are very unlikely to get an agreement unless it is reasonably fair, and even if we did get an agreement, it probably wouldn't stick. Let me explain that. I'm sure you're all aware, rich countries have contributed the most to the climate change we are already experiencing, and rich countries will continue to contribute a lot, even though you will have heard that countries like China and so on are now emitting more. But at a per capita level, the rich countries of the world continue to out-pollute even the most polluting developing countries by a long mile. The US average per capita emissions are about 20 tonnes a person of carbon dioxide a year. In the UK, we might think we're a lot better. We're only about 9.8 tonnes per person. China, which we keep hearing about as a major polluter, is actually only 3.8 tonnes per person a year. And India, which is also increasingly signalled by the rich countries as an excuse for them not doing more, is only 1.8 or thereabouts tonnes per year. Malawi is less than 0.1 tonnes per person, less than a 90th per person of what we emit in this country. So that gives you a sense of the continuing disparities between rich and poor countries.